Got up early and before we start, the creation science group of the area here, right back here on this table, and they're really doing a fine job of assisting in your growth in this one particular area of creation science and all. And let me just mention a couple things. They have several opportunities. Well, they've got back there a whole list of books. They've got a bunch of different books on the table, but a whole list of things that could be obtained from them. So, by all means, what's he doing? Can I trust him?
We lost it.
Oh, did I? Anyway, also they've got a back there. They've got a whole stack of these free. This is a free CD you're giving away, called "The God of Wonders." It's back there. It's really a sweet CD. It's back there. Stop and look at the other books, but you get this one for free. And then they also have a family camp coming up this summer, this July. So there are some opportunities that you need to take advantage of. What are we doing? I'm going to get out of the way and let them do it.
It's furniture moving day.
I guess. Do what? Oh. I can.
You going to survive?
Huh?
You going to survive or confusing?
I'm going to survive. Have we survived already?
Well, we can praise the Lord because we're here.
Okay, we're done. Mount St. Helens. I promised you last night this is going to be a good one, but I'm not silly enough to know on Saturday morning. You certainly got to start with a joke on Saturday morning, this early, right? Because there are two cave ladies talking over the back fence. One of them says to the other about her husband, "Oh, he can walk upright. He just hadn't had his coffee yet." Well, that's kind of the way I feel this morning. The Mount St. Helens issue, Dr. Steve Austin, if you know him, he's been the bulldog behind this main investigation. He and I have done most of the research together. We co-authored this book a couple years ago, called Footprints in the Ash. There's a stack up on the table back there, although not a very tall stack. So as soon as this is over, you want to run back there and get that book. Or run back there and order it because it's already out. But this is a wonderful book. It's got a firm salvation message at the end of it. To a non-Christian, it just, wow, this makes so much sense. And then you're confronted with the gospel, and God has really used this book. It's got a CD also. Dr. Steve Austin is on the CD. It's a lecture, kind of like you're going to hear now, but I used to live in California, and when things are moving,
This is Japan.
actually my book, Young Earth, I kidded Steve. I was after Steve for probably 20 years. Steve, we've got to write this Mount St. Helens up in a book. And he just didn't want to do it. He says, we're not finished with our research yet. He didn't want to do it. Well, finally, I got tired of him waiting on him. So I wrote this book, The Young Earth, and included most of the arguments from Mount St. Helens in here. I don't know if he has recognized that yet, but anyway, my fossil record book is back there. There's some other books that need mentioning. My father, Dr. Henry Morris, compiled the notes to this Defender's Bible. Every passage in Scripture that's been charged that there's a contradiction or an error, he defends it, as we're commanded to do in Scripture, to defend the faith. This is that kind of Bible. I've used a lot of study Bibles in my life, and this is the only one I use these days. It's just so rich and so powerful. By the way, this is a great book to have at your side when the cults come knocking on your door. misusing Scripture. Another book that's back there, there's a whole series of books. The geology book, the astronomy book, the fossil book, all kinds of things. This is the geology book that I wrote. Again, all these books have a lot of pictures in it, and they're access to pictures that you can use. This is written mainly like for an early 8th grade science class. For a lot of homeschoolers use this as their 8th grade earth science class textbook. But it's just a lot of good information about things. Well, let's go to Mount St. Helens and see what's there. Mount St. Helens in days past was referred to as the jewel of the Pacific Northwest. And sure enough, it is a beautiful mountain. Beautiful mountain. Just, it's there in southern Washington, the state of Washington. But you can see the forest is in the mountain here, glacier-covered mountains, sportsman's paradise. A lot of mountain climbing, a lot of camping, a lot of campgrounds around the lake. This is a lake called Spirit Lake. I'll refer to that here in a little bit. In my preparations for the climbing Mount Ararat in Turkey, I climbed many of the mountains in the Pacific Northwest for training. I never did climb Mount St. Helens. Well, I've climbed it now, but it doesn't look this way anymore. Geologists have known for decades that pressures inside the earth were building up and were forcing lava to the surface. And as this lava was forced to the surface, of course it's under great pressure from the weight of all the rock above it, and under that great pressure, even though it's very hot down there in that liquid lava, the liquid water is still in liquid form because it's under such great pressure. But as the lava comes closer to the surface, the pressure is relieved and the liquid water explodes into steam, and that is the explosive eruption that you see at some volcanoes where it explodes out the top. That's a steam pressure release is what it mainly is, but of course it carries with it a lot of rocky materials too. There's really two different kinds of volcanoes. One is which the lava itself comes up and then rolls down the side. The other is this explosive type volcano. Mount St. Helens was an explosive type, and it was different though. Well, on the scale of volcanoes, this was kind of a dinky little volcano. It was a small volcano. There have been many, even in history, much bigger than Mount St. Helens. But the thing that made it different was it did not explode out the top. It exploded out the side. And if you happen to be standing on the north side there by Spirit Lake, there was nothing dinky about it. Let me show you. It was in March of 1980 that it did its first little poof, just a little minor eruption, just a little poof. Here we are from a helicopter looking over the summit. This is the summit. Looking down below, that's Spirit Lake. In March, covered by ice and snow. There's the forest. So you see what I'm doing, looking over top the mountain. And just this little poof. And all that happened at that point was it melted a hole in the glacier and put a lot of dirty snow up there. But then it seemed like every day was another poof. And every day there was another poof. And finally, after about 6 weeks of poofs, there was a big hole in the glacier, a lot of dirty snow. There's an airplane for scale. That's a big hole in the glacier. And then the mountain kind of quieted down. And for the next month and a half or so, there were no more poofs. Well, but that was a good thing because it allowed geologists from all over the world to gather at Mount St. Helens to observe this impending eruption. We knew it was about to pop big time. We didn't know really when, but we knew it was coming. It was coming. And so they installed up here, right up here, a seismic observation station, the U.S. Geologic Survey, a seismic observation station. The problem with an observation station is it needs an observer. And so, well, I got to tell you something about geologists. Every geologist in the world loves to see a good geologic process in operation. But also every geologist considers himself or herself to be an excellent photographer. Geologists can take a great picture, and well, they all claim to, and some of us can, you know what I mean? But they put this observation station right here and stationed one of their geologists up there. They gave him a camera, say, hey, stay here and take a picture of anything that might happen. And he did. Well, he did die in the eruption, as did about 50 other people, most of them geologists in there trying to get pictures. But another thing that was noticed, this area right here below the crater, they put some surveyor monuments in here and were monitoring the ground surface and stuff. And they noticed that every day the ground surface was 5 feet higher than it was the day before. 5 feet higher. Now, it doesn't take a great geologist to know that that can't go on. I mean, something's got, it's like a balloon was blowing up and it was about to pop. That's what was happening. From below looking up, this swell right here, this was not there 2 months before. This is, I don't even know how to understand this picture, just this big blister right there. And it's about to rupture. And on May 18th, it did. The morning of May 18th, daybreak, beautiful morning, cloudless morning, geologists were already up in their airplane monitoring everything that happened at Mount St. Helens. Now, for our purposes, that's a good thing, because what I'm trying to do here with Mount St. Helens is to apply this catastrophe, which we observed and which we know a lot about, to the great flood of Noah's day. That catastrophe, a much bigger catastrophe, but we did not see that. We didn't see that one, and the Bible says we'll never see another one like that. Well, I'm going to apply the Mount St. Helens eruption to the great flood of Noah's day. Much about Noah's flood was volcanic and tectonic. It says on the day the flood started in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, it says on the particular day after Noah had gotten on board and then was there for 6 days or 7 days, and then it says on that particular day all the fountains of the great deep were broken open, and the windows of heaven were open, and the rain was on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. The fountains of the great deep. The deep is the briny deep. That's the ocean. The great deep is the deep ocean, evidently. And the fountains, well, think volcanics. Think something's in there that's spewing out now and erupting out. We know what happens when a volcano erupts underwater. We know about that. It causes a tsunami. We know about this. And this was, on one particular day, all the fountains of the great deep. They're all around the world, these fountains, the remnants of them. And these fountains would have set loose these tsunamis and the world that then was being overflowed with water perished, the Bible says. When you think about the flood, don't think about the little ark floating along on a lake on a Sunday afternoon. You know the picture, the one with the giraffe sticking his neck out. Noah's flood was not like that. When you think about Noah's flood, think about walls of water several hundred feet high racing at several hundred miles an hour. These tsunamis travel at about the speed of sound. These are very energetic, very devastating. And we have evidence that some of these tsunamis were over 1,000 feet high. When you think about the flood, think about a 1,000-foot wave crashing into the land at several hundred miles an hour. And then you're starting to think about Noah's flood. Or think about these underwater mud flows we talked about last night. The total world was restructured. The Bible says it was a volcanic and a tectonic event. It just wasn't just a water-related event, but of course it was that. So a lot about the flood was tectonic, like a volcano, but a lot about the volcano eruption was water-related. Because as you can see there, well, the last picture, there's a glacier on top. Now, a glacier is really what? That's water. That's frozen water. And now this mountain is getting very hot. Well, what happens to ice when it gets hot? It melts. And suddenly we've got a whole lake of liquid water on top of a pointy mountain. And where does that go? That comes down. And it came down as a flood. Avalanching down the mountain, racing down the mountain at 90 miles an hour, devastating everything in its path. The trees, the boulders, the elk, the dirt, everything was just ripped up and then slopped down at the base of the mountain. It laid a big pancake layer. of sediments there at the base, and then another mud flow came down, and then another mud flow, and then another mud flow. And before that afternoon was over, 600 feet of water-deposited strata had been laid down. Now, in geology, I was taught it takes millions and millions of years to lay down 600 feet of strata. No, it doesn't. It takes one afternoon. We saw it happen. Got it? So now I'm going to apply what happened at Mount St. Helens to what happened during the flood. The flood was a much bigger scale, but the same quality of catastrophe. Let's look. On the morning of the eruption, geologists are already up, observing everything that was happening. We know exactly what happened at Mount St. Helens. And the results of Mount St. Helens were much like the results of the flood, we speculate. Got it? Well, that was at daybreak. At 8:30 in the morning, two other geologists were circling the mountain to see just anything that might happen. This was monitored just moment by moment. And these two geologists looked over and they saw this oversteepened, bulging north side begin to shake and to slide away. And you can see here, this sliding. This is an avalanche. Before the next few seconds, this whole zone of the mountain was sliding down. Turned out to be the biggest landslide ever witnessed by man right here at Mount St. Helens. They knew what was about to happen. It's like taking a Coke bottle and shaking it up real good and building up the pressures and then popping the lid off. Well, the lid was coming off the Coke bottle right here, and it was about to explode. So the geologists expeditiously left the area. You can see the tail of their airplane. Just a few seconds earlier, they would have been in the path of this blast cloud. They would have been vaporized probably by that poisonous, superheated blast cloud. But as they were leaving, one of them had the presence of mind to lean out the window of the airplane and take one last picture. A geologist would do anything for a good picture. But notice that this eruption is not going up. It's going out to the side. Got it? Here's a fellow named Gary Rosenquist. He's about 20 miles away. He's been camping out there just hoping to get some good pictures. Got it? He's on what we now call the third ridge away from the mountain. He's about 20 miles. He's safe. There's that bulge before the eruption. There's the first ridge. See that little ridge there? And then here's the second ridge, the stand of trees here. He's on the third ridge. He's standing next to some trees here. Got it? He's on the third ridge. Well, 8:27 in the morning, he wakes up. It's a clear morning. He takes this picture. He's trying to get some coffee going. And 8:30 in the morning, boom, the mountain explodes. He drops his coffee, grabs his camera, and he takes this picture. And, well, you can see, he's on the third ridge. First ridge, second ridge, third ridge here. He's safe. He's 20 miles away. But as he took this picture, he noticed, that eruption, it's not going up. It's coming this way. He did notice that. But a geologist would do anything for a good picture. And so he cranks his camera. This is back in the days when you had to crank your film, and so he cranked his camera and he took another picture. And just that quick, there the blast is, coming up the first ridge. He's safe. He's on the third ridge. But he did notice that thing's coming this way. I mean, he noticed that. But a geologist would do anything for a good picture, right? So he cranks his camera and he takes another picture. And there it is, racing toward him at the speed of a jet airliner, and it's coming up the second ridge. And it's coming this way. But he's on the third ridge, and a geologist would do anything for a good picture, right? So he cranks his camera, and he takes another picture. And there it is, coming up the third ridge, melting these trees he's standing next to. Now, it's at about this time that the geologist makes a very interesting decision. Says, I think I got enough pictures now. So he turns around to leave and starts running for his pickup truck. And, of course, he takes his camera. But he gets to his pickup truck thoroughly expecting to be overwhelmed, knocked down, fried by this poisonous blast cloud. But as he got to his truck, it hadn't hit him. What happened? As it turns out, the blast cloud, that third ridge, was situated at just the right location to where this expanding blast cloud, expanding, in ever bigger and bigger concentric circles from the mountain point source, it's losing its energy, losing its velocity, and here it is 20 miles away, and a much bigger and slower now. It's slowed down to about 120 miles an hour. That's twice freeway speeds. But that third ridge was situated at just the right location to where it deflected that blast cloud up into the air. And there he is standing by his truck, and he looked back, and there went the blast cloud right up over his head, right up over the trees he's standing next to. And he's looking up at the bottom of this blast cloud. And he takes a picture, of course. But he was able to escape and survive. Soon enough, that blast cloud came back down, but it had cooled off enough to where he didn't die. He survived, and he got out. With his pictures, yes. Way to go, geologist. That blast that day lasted about 9 hours. And in those 9 hours, expended about as much energy in this one dinky little volcano as 40,000 atomic bombs that were dropped over Hiroshima in World War II. 40,000 atomic bombs in this one dinky little volcano. Just think of the power that God has at his disposal to use as he chooses. Amazing. But that blast, what had been a sportsman's paradise, was suddenly an utter wasteland. Nothing was alive in here. Nothing. Not a blade of grass, not an insect, not an elk, nothing big. Nothing could survive that blast. And actually, most of the damage done by the eruption was done by the avalanche. That avalanche, that bulging area up here, of course, this is all what avalanched out. 4 billion cubic yards of rock. That's a lot of rock. 4 billion, B with a billion, cubic yards of rock. Slid down that mountain, avalanched down, 4 billion cubic yards. 1 billion came down this way, avalanching down at 90 miles an hour, and it plopped into the lake. This is what's left of Spirit Lake over here. Now, you know what happens if you take a rock and you throw it in the lake. It makes a ripple, right? What kind of a ripple do you think would be caused by 1 billion cubic yards of rock plopping into a lake at 90 miles an hour? Okay, you think about that. I'll come back to it. The other 3 billion cubic yards came down this way. And it came down this way. And it came way down drainage. Down, and down, and down, and down, and down, and down. And came on down miles and miles and laid down this big pancake of sediments. Just a slop. And now there's a big pancake, and then another one, another pancake, another. Pretty soon there's a whole stack of pancakes, 600 feet thick, of water deposited straight up. I wanted to carve a canyon. Standing here at the top of this 600 feet, geologists try to study the rocks in that sense. We try to understand what kind of process was involved in their deposition as sediments. And I want to know when a rock is deposited by a 90-mile-an-hour mud flow, when that mud flow comes to a halt and there's a pancake, I want to know what's happened, you know? I want to know what's on the inside of that rock. You know, sometimes you see rocks and you see the internal layerings and maybe they're tilted, you know, all kinds of, we call it that sedimentary structure. I want to know what a 90-mile-an-hour mud flow looks like when it gets halted. I want to carve a canyon in this thing, like Grand Canyon, and then so we can look at the side of the pancakes. You cut them in half and look at the side view of the pancakes and see all the pancakes stacked on top. I want to know what a 90-mile-an-hour mud flow looks like. Okay, you keep that in mind. I'll come back to it. Got it? Well, that blast, that's what's left of the forest. See these trees here? These are big trees. Notice that a lot of them are pointed in the same direction. They're pointed away from the volcano. That blast cloud as it came out just broke off the trees at ground level, or maybe with a root ball beneath, and laid them down facing away from the source. They built a road up in there now, and if you're ever down in the state of Washington, you must go see Mount St. Helens. Spend a couple days up there. It'll take your breath away. 250 square miles of forest just broken and laid down and just right there. And well, it's growing back now. It's not quite so stark. But, man, what you're looking at there is the wages of sin. I mean, that's a dead zone. Now, trees don't sin, but Adam's sin ruined all that very good creation, and we have the remnant of it now. We have the record of the wages of sin everywhere we look. A lot of those trees then got caught in the mud flows, and, well, this is many miles away, but the mud is now channelized into the local drainage of the mountain, the streams, and now running down that stream is a log mat, just a log jam. And, of course, the logs, well, this bridge was busted out, I think, about 10 seconds after this picture was taken, but did most of the monetary damage. Interestingly enough, these mud flows, this was still flowing at 40 miles an hour when it rounded this bend. People standing here were watching it. 40 miles an hour, there's mud coming down. And a lot of the trees somehow maintained an erect posture. I mean, they're logs. They're just, you know, but a lot of them somehow maintained an erect posture and were floating down the river at 40 miles an hour. Kind of cool. You keep that in mind. I'll come back to it. And when the mud came to a halt, the logs, some of them still maintained their erect posture. Trunks up, roots down. See that? But it did not grow here. It was transported here in a 40-mile-an-hour mud flow. Got it? Well, the mountain continued to erupt for the next several years, and every time it erupted, whatever ice and snow had accumulated up at the top melted, came down as another mud flow, another pancake layer. And actually, here's a picture of one of those mud flows. This is from a helicopter. A friend of mine is a helicopter pilot out there, and he was given the task of going in there and trying to rescue some of these silly geologists trying to get pictures. And but he said several times they'd look out and there would be a mud flow coming right out of his helicopter at 90 miles an hour. And there he is in this high-powered helicopter trying to outrun this wall of mud. And here he took this picture of this wall of mud coming at him. This is mud. It's like cement off of a cement truck. It's that thickness, that consistency, but it's moving. You can actually see the rapids in the mud as it comes towards you. This is a scary picture. I mean, I just don't process this real well. If you really understand what you're seeing, how could this be? This is the kind of thing I think destroyed the world in the days of the flood. These were underwater mud flows, but cement could flow underwater and not really mix in with everything else. I mean, it would still flow underwater. And this is flowing under air, same fluid mechanics. But this is the way it was, I think, during the flood. And these pancakes are now the strata, the geologic strata that we see in road cuts and in Grand Canyon and wherever. Well, I wanted to carve a canyon in that stack of pancakes, but didn't really have to because, as you can see, the pancakes are still hot. This is after the eruption. You can see they're still steaming hot. But then sometimes that steam would collect in such a way that the steam would explode. Here's a steam explosion. The technical term, steam explosion. And it would ream out a steam explosion pit. There's a big pit. Here's a smaller one from a helicopter looking down. This is a steam explosion pit. Well, see, we don't have to carve a canyon because somebody has taken an orange juice glass and stuck it down through the pancakes, and now we can, from the inside of the hole, we can see the pancakes inside view like I wanted to see from a canyon. Well, I promised you that this was really interesting stuff, that this would make your socks roll up and down, right? Well, I realize not everybody likes geology as much as I like it, okay? But this is really interesting to me. I mean, who in their right mind, I mean, we can go down inside the steam explosion pit and see these straight on the side. Who in their right mind, though, would not want to go down inside a steam explosion pit on the side of an active volcano? I mean, this is good stuff, okay? All right, let's go down inside the steam explosion pit and have a look around. Yeah, wow. Notice these steep-sided walls and the bedded deposits. This is one pancake here. This was a 40-mile-an-hour mud flow. This was a 90-mile-an-hour mud flow. And this was a different one. You can see this is that 90-mile-an-hour. It's here. In fact, here's a person for scale. There's that 40-mile-an-hour mud flow. These are just the top 3 pancakes, the top 100 feet or so of the 600-foot deposit. Look at this 90-mile-an-hour mud flow. I guess if you had asked me before I started studying Mount St. Helens what a 90-mile-an-hour mud flow would look like, I would say it would just mix everything up, and if it came to a halt, it would just be just a slot deposit. Well, no. What water does best is to sort things out into different grain sizes and chemistries, and look at all this sorting, this sedimentary structure in there. In fact, look up closer. You see, you've seen rocks like this, right? With all this internal layering. And some of this stuff is just really thin stuff. This is a 90-mile-an-hour mud flow. Now, as a geologist, I was taught how to interpret this kind of mud flow. And the way a geologist is taught to think, the way I was taught to think, the way every geologist is taught to think, that each one of these different layers, just a millimeter thick or so, each one of these layers represents a year's worth of accumulation of sediments at the bottom of a calm ocean or lake or something. These are called varves in geology. And the way if a geologist were given the task, if they didn't know the history of this area, and they were given the task of determining how long it took for all these sediments to accumulate, the way they do it, I'll teach you. I got a PhD in this stuff, all right? You got your thinking caps on? I'll teach you how to interpret this stuff. The way they determine how long it took, they assign 1 year to each one of those layers, and they come in, they go like this. They go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And there are millions and millions of these things in there. Well, obviously it took millions and millions of years. No, it didn't. It took 4 hours one afternoon. We saw it happen. How long does it take to form these strata? I mean, how long does it take? Well, this rock is in Grand Canyon. But the character of the rock is the same. I mean, it looks like the same kinds of processes were involved. So you see how I'm going to apply Mount St. Helens to the Great Flood. Look at this. This is a Grand Canyon rock. This looks like a Mount St. Helens rock. Here's one of those steam explosion pits. Well, we didn't have to have a canyon, but I still did want a canyon. But again, we didn't have to carve one because the eruption happened in May of 1980, and this whole stack of pancakes in 1980. But then there was another mud flow in 1982 that came down the mountain and filled in that steam explosion pit. Yeah, the pit dates from 1980, but then the mud flow filled in the steam explosion pit and kept coming and busted out the downhill into this steam explosion pit and then emptied the pit. And now we can stand here on the edge of the steam explosion pit and look down a canyon. It's a scale model of Grand Canyon. It's not quite as big as Grand Canyon, but I've got pictures of Grand Canyon from the air overlooking Grand Canyon that look just like this. Here we are standing on the edge of the steam explosion pit. That's my buddy, Dr. Steve Austin. Steve is a very good geologist. He's the guy on the video back there. He's a very good geologist. I'm the president of ICR, but I am a geologist, and so he and I do a lot of our geology work together. But he's really the director of this research. He's a very good scientist. I've never met a geologist as good as he. But Steve's a geologist. Steve can also take good pictures. But Steve is not only a good photographer and a good geologist, he's smart. I mean, he's really smart. Whenever he and I are out together, he makes me carry the camera. And I love taking pictures. But it occurred to me a couple years ago that I have thousands of pictures of Steve Austin out in the field and none of me. Steve's smart. There's some other of our research buddies over there. Standing right on the edge of that nearly 100-foot near vertical slope on the edge of the steam explosion pit. Here's Steve standing right on the edge of a vertical slope. This material here is like a sand. It's sand grain-sized particles. Let me ask you a question. Would you stand on the edge of a 100-foot vertical slope of loose sand? If you tried, you wouldn't stand there very long because it would break and you'd fall and die. But Steve is standing right there on the edge of that thing. Well, it's obviously hardened. It's a rock now. So here's a question. How long does it take for a sandy deposit to harden into a sandstone? I was taught it takes millions and millions of years. That's the answer to almost every question in geology, millions and millions of years. But that deposit was laid down in 1980. The pit was breached in 82. I took this picture in 85. And so in 5 years, that sandy deposit had hardened into a sandstone that could stand in a vertical cliff. And you hit it with a hammer, bing, you know, like concrete almost. It doesn't take long periods of time. It just takes the right conditions. There's a canyon. If a geologist were given the task of determining, didn't know the history of the area, given the task of determining how long did take this canyon to form, the way a geologist is taught to think, the way every 8th grade earth science student is taught to think, the way you were taught to think back in school, if you remember, if you were paying attention, is that whenever you see a big wide canyon and a stream running through the middle of it, that this stream migrating back and forth over millions and millions of years carved out the big wide canyon. That's the way all of us were taught to think. And it's wrong. It's just wrong. It's wrong thinking. This canyon was not formed by that stream. This canyon was formed by a 40-mile-an-hour mud flow one day, and now the stream is flowing where the mud flow carved out a canyon. Got it? But it just reminds me so much of Grand Canyon. I mean, I've been all through Grand Canyon. Down at the center of Grand Canyon, I mean, it looks kind of like this, the inner gorge with the steep-sided walls, the bedded deposits. There's the Colorado River running through. There's some giants standing next to the Colorado River. One of them named Steve Austin. Turns out this right here, actually, when they walked through, I let them get ahead of me so I could take this picture. But then I followed within a second. And I got right here, and I broke through a crust kind of on top of this mud. The water in the stream is still very hot. It's still so hot, it'll scald your skin right off. But as I broke through this crust, suddenly this whole area turned into quicksand. An area I'm sinking down in quicksand. Now, I don't like quicksand. I mean, I just don't like quicksand. Especially scalding hot quicksand. They say if you're ever in quicksand, you're supposed to lie real still and be quiet. I got some news for you. When you're sinking down in scalding hot quicksand, lying still and being quiet, that's not the first thing on your mind. Well, you would think that Steve Austin, he'd come back and give me a hand and help me get out of here. Well, Steve did come back. He says, "Here, quick, throw me your camera." Well, obviously I got out. Staying there was not an option. Whew. But Grand Canyon. Oh, there's so much I want to tell you about Grand Canyon. I just don't have time. But notice all these bedded deposits, the steep walls. This is a big canyon. Oh, let me go on. We talked yesterday some about radioisotope dating, and mentioned to you that the kind of rock that can be dated is rock that used to be in a hot liquid condition. When lava is liquid, it's red hot, and then when it cools into a solid, that starts the clock ticking. So when you date that kind of rock, you're dating how long ago did it cool from a liquid into a solid. That's the way the theory works. Well, there you can see some molten rock down inside the volcano. This is from a helicopter looking down the throat of the volcano right after the eruption. Well, it's been building up. This lava has now solidified into, well, into a lava dome. This is plugging up the throat of the volcano. And that's the kind of rock that can be dated. Well, again, you date the time. The age of the rock is how long ago did it cool from a liquid into a solid. Well, Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, and this rock dates from 1980 or since then, okay? So if we have been up there and gotten a sample of that very hot rock and taken it to the laboratory and dated it, how old is that rock up there? I mean, really, how old is that rock? I mean, it has to date since 1980. This rock, in reality, in truth, is less than 30 years old. We know that's the date of this rock because we saw it form. Got it? We know this. But when you take it into a laboratory and date it, how old does it date? Yeah, 2.4 million years old. We talked about that yesterday. The method just doesn't work. It doesn't work. Every time you can check radioisotope dating, every time it's wrong. It's wrong. Every time a rock of known historic date is dated, it always dates millions and millions of years. Well, they still trust it, though, for dating those that we can't check. This is not the kind of thing that ought to cause a Christian to doubt God's Word. Radioisotope dating, it's a very precise method, and the measurements are careful. But the assumptions whereby it's dated, it's interpreted, are what's wrong. Well, I've got a good discussion of that in my Young Earth book and in the Mount St. Helens book. But get back to the mountain. Remember, we talked about that billion cubic yards of rock plopping into the lake and what kind of a ripple it would cause? Well, it turns out that ripple was a real tsunami. It was 900 feet high, racing across the lake, slamming into the shoreline of the mountainside on the other side of the lake. And this is a solid, hard rock mountain. Used to be covered with dirt and trees and rabbits and whatever else was up here. And that wave went up and came back down, just scoured off everything, such that now this is what geology calls a scour slope. It's been scoured off. Okay, here's a question. How long does it take to form a scour slope? Yeah, I was taught millions and millions of years, but I have to teach you how to say that. You can't just say the words. You have to use your hands. It takes both hands. When you say million, you have to say millions and millions. You have to. It's just this arm waving, sorry, out rolling, and you got to cock your head just right. Millions and millions of years, and you try that. It just feels right. You just can't sit here and say millions and millions, millions and millions. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. How long does it take to form a scour slope? Nope, 17 seconds, near as we can tell. But when that came back down, it brought with it all the trees that had been up here. And now floating in the lake, if you pardon the expression, millions and millions of trees are floating in that lake. You can see right here, this is a rug of logs. This is a log jam floating in the lake. 4 million logs. I know, we counted them. Notice this spit of land, the wind shifts, the logs blow around. You can see they're just floating. Creationists have been talking about the potential of a floating log mat as something that would have happened during the flood. The pre-flood forest would have been ripped up and now they're floating on the world ocean. And we had proposed that as that floated around, it would decay and collect underneath the floating log mat. The decay remnants would collect into a layer of peat. Peat is thought to be the precursor of coal, and this is our model for the origin of coal. This would have happened during the flood as these forests were floating around. And the standard theory for the origin of coal is in a swamp. The organic materials collect at the bottom of the swamp, and then from time to time that would be submerged under the ocean and then buried by ocean sediments thousands of feet deep, and over millions of years of heat and pressure then that peat will harden into coal. But this is a peat. This is a modern peat, swamp peat. This doesn't look at all like coal. Notice the roots penetrating through it. This has like a coffee grounds texture to it. This is the way a peat looks. This has been drained, and so we can see the side view of the blanket of peat. But a coal looks very different. If you've ever studied coal, you know it has all these layers in it. Some of the layers are shiny black, some of them are dull black. A lot of clay partings in here. In fact, if you ever shovel coal into a furnace, you have to go back and pull out the clinkers. Remember that, guys? I pulled out lots of clinkers from our coal furnaces. But that's the clay part of the coal that doesn't burn. But this is what a coal looks like. Well, we had proposed this floating mat model for the origin of coal, but evolutionists said this is a very weak model because it's totally hypothetical. There's never been a floating mat ever to study. Well, and they were right, but in 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted, and suddenly there was a floating mat, and you can bet your booties we've been up there studying it ever since. There's that floating mat. Remember that piece of coal, the shiny parts of coal, the shiny bands, that's mummified bark. That's the bark part of the tree. The dull parts are the other parts of the tree. But the shiny bands are the bark sheets. But notice as this mat is floating around, as these trees are floating around, the bark has already been abraded off. It's just bare wood you're looking at there. We wondered, had that bark sunk to the bottom? Well, we wanted to know what's at the bottom of this lake. Well, the lake is very hazardous to your health. It's got poison stuff in there. But what's a geologist to do? I mean, we wanted to know what's at the bottom of that lake. A geologist would do anything for a good picture, right? Well, there goes Steve Austin about to scuba dive down underneath the lake, and sure enough, underneath that floating mat is a layer of peat, an organic layer of woody materials. And notice the sheet, like this is bark. This is the bark part of the tree. It's not the tree, it's bark. And then all this other stuff mixed in with it. This looks very much like coal. Several layers of shiny interspersed with dull. This is what a coal looks like. You can pick one of those up and brush it off, you can see it's redwood bark. This is not coal, this is peat. But everything is here. A lot of clay is mixed in, volcanic clay. So it looks like it would make a good coal. By the way, how long does it take to turn peat into coal? You're catching on. Did you know that you can make coal in a laboratory in a matter of hours or days? It doesn't take long. It just takes the right conditions. It mainly takes heat. It doesn't take pressure. It takes heat. If you heat it away from oxygen so it can't burn, it can readily metamorphose into coal. But a catalyst for that reaction that jump starts it is a volcanic clay. That's the real key. That chemical in there jump starts that reaction, and it happens quickly. So it doesn't take a long time. It just takes the right conditions. Well, the right conditions are all met except for the last heating episode. If this were to be buried under another hot pancake, it could rapidly become a coal. It's not become a coal yet. It's a peat still. But everything's solved or satisfied. Well, I still have a few minutes, don't I? I either have 10 minutes yet, or I have an hour in 10 minutes, or I'm 50 minutes over. I forget which one. 5 minutes? Hey, I'll make it. Hang on. Let me show you one more lesson that we learned from Mount St. Helens. Well, we learned many, but let me show you one more. The more we studied that log mat, the more we noticed that some of those logs were floating upright. Now, what would cause a self-respecting log to float upright? But some of them were. They were floating upright. Of course, a lot of them floating horizontal, but some of them floating upright. What's going on? We got to where we could draw this sketch. These logs float around flat. You can see which end is the root end. But as they waterlog, they really waterlog root end first and would sink root end first. And some of them would sink and end up on the bottom flat, but some of them we suspected would end up root end down and still sticking straight up. And because the lake is still receiving so much sediment, it's filling up with sediments, that the roots would be in several different layers. Well, it's easy to figure out at Mount St. Helens, but if we didn't know the history, would wonder, did this tree grow here? Or is there some other way? And did this grow here? Was this a different forest, separated in time by different accumulations of sediments? Well, we would know that they grew at the same time because, well, we know they from the same forest. We know that they would grow at the same time because their tree ring patterns would match. You know, wet year, wet year, wet year, dry year, wet year, dry year, dry year, wet year, wet year. You know, that same pattern would match in all the different trees, even though they're in different layers. It reminds us of a place in Yellowstone Park. There's a very famous site there called Specimen Ridge, where actually, if you were to ask, a few years ago, if you were to ask a geologist, give me evidence that the Bible is not correct, the answer would usually be Specimen Ridge. This is the classic argument that the Bible is wrong. This has caused many, many Christians to lose their faith. This has given many non-believers excuse for rejecting Christianity. This is a powerful tool in the hands of the enemy. Well, obviously, we've had to go up there and understand it and try to see if there's another interpretation. And so we have been up there. If you believe your roadside evolution lesson, the way they interpret that, in that hillside I just showed you are many, many petrified trees. Petrified trees, and a lot of them standing up. These standing stumps, they call it a Yellowstone's fossil forest. Here's what Yellowstone's fossil forests are unique. Many stumps still stand upright in the same sites where they grew millions and millions of years ago. And the interesting thing is that in that hillside you can see 27 different pancake layers. And in each one of the layers are some upright stumps. Most of them are horizontal, some of them are upright. And, well, here I've drawn again for clarity. They would say that this particular forest was growing at some time in the past, and then it got buried by volcanic ash. Some of the trees maintained their upright stance and petrified upright. And then over time that ash turned into a soil, another forest grew, and then that got buried by volcanic ash, and some of them were upright. And that turned into a soil, and then that one, and that one. 27 successive forests, each requiring at least 1,000 years of time. The total package of all these 27 layers, actually there are 50 layers. Right here there's 27, but there's 50 layers or so. And then the erosion, that total package requires many, many, many thousands of years. Thousands and thousands of years. Much longer than the Bible will allow. This is proof that the Bible is wrong, so they say. Well, let's go and take a look. The petrified trees are absolutely gorgeous. This hillside here is almost vertical. It's really steep. But you get up there and the trees are there, and petrified trees are really rock. They're hard. They're hard as rock. I mean, they are rock. They're just hard as rock. They're hard. They're rock. And how long does it take to petrify wood? You're catching on. There's many examples where wood can be petrified quickly. It can happen almost. In fact, there are some laboratories that petrify wood on purpose. They can do it. They're making hardwood floors. I mean, they're really hardwood floors. It's a matter of injection with silica. But these trees, there's some growing trees there now on that same slope. But the petrified trees, they're really quite stunning. But the more we studied, we found some. Well, here's a petrified tree. This is a growing tree behind it. Notice that here on this tree, you can see the root ball. The roots of a tree are bigger than the tree, but the roots have been broken off. This tree did not grow here. It grew somewhere else, was broken off, and transported here, and somehow maintained its erect posture. And notice also, there's evidence of a mud flow in here. And evidently, some volcanic event somewhere else destroyed a forest, and mud flows from that forest brought in one layer of mud with some uprights, and then another layer of mud with some more uprights, and then another layer of mud. And all of these uprights grew at the same time, even though they're in different layers. And that project has now been done. And the tree rings from all these different layers have been compared, and they match. They match. All these trees came from the same forest. Point is, the classic argument that the Bible is wrong, and the Bible's still right. Well, we checked that out there at Mount St. Helens. Oh, that's the one picture I have of me. But we had what's called a side-scanning sonar. It's like radar off the side of a boat, and prints out a paper record. And that gave us evidence that there are thousands of upright floaters and upright sinkers there at the bottom of the lake. We even checked it out. We went underwater to check it out. Well, final point. We took this back to the rangers at Yellowstone Park and showed them that their sign was wrong. There's a better explanation. Well, you know what they did. They took down the sign. Guys, we won one for a change. They took down the wrong evolution lesson, wrong information. Well, that's the point of all we've been talking about is, dear friends, dear Christian friends, the Bible is right. The Bible is right even when it talks about these difficult areas of science and history and the age of the earth. The Bible's right. We can trust it in every area. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm done. So, brother, you're on. Are you just going to say we're taking a break now, or what are we doing?